Okay, back again. Time to talk about color. I don't have a formula or a recipe. I think I have go-to pigments and all of that, but I try, just before I start drawing, always to ask myself, what is the intent? What's the main story here? Same thing when I think about moving into color. One size doesn't fit all. I could see doing this painting almost monochromatically, all in sepia tones, which is something I do occasionally with my paintings. I think I don't want to do that. I am compelled by some of what I see in this relatively bright, cheerful color scheme. I could ignore it, but I think it suits, and that's what I'm going to try to do here. Very transparent colors. I think the drama of the composition and the drawing itself should hold the day, and I could get by with a little less color, but clean, crisp, brighter colors in general, I think is the way I want to go. Again, I could see doing this very dark and gloomy and stormy, but I want sort of the mix of the drama of the drawing with a somewhat lighter touch in the painting, if that makes sense. So as always, I think of color as value more than just color. Is it light? Is it dark? Is it warm? Is it cool? That's what goes through my mind. I try not to get seduced by beautiful pigment colors. I'm human, it happens. But in general, I have color stories that are complement based. Light versus dark, warm versus cool. What I'm doing here is with a medium-sized Neef brush. These are one of my Thomas W Schaller brushes. I'm just scrubbing in some clear water because I want to maintain this as light up here, so I don't want to cover that with any color. This is a way I do skies. Again, I don't have all the answers. Everybody has a different approach. This one works for me very often, where I'll use gravity. So I don't wet the whole page first because I want to maintain some edges. Oops, I dropped some paint on, so it's a good place to start. So I wash down with just clear, if you do a wash of just clear water, that I'm bumping into it here and there with the wet pigment. So if done well, what I'm going to end up with is an edge that is a combination of lost and found, soft and hard edges that I'm just scrubbing it in with the side of a mop brush. So here and there I touch the wet area, here and there I hold it back from the wet area. And with that approach, what I hope is that I end up with an effect of a sky that looks convincing but not overdone or overworked. And then what I want overall is for the sky to morph from light into mid-tone. I'm working on a tilted board about 40 degrees. But at the moment, I'm holding it up more flat, reducing the angle with my left hand, painting with my right, in order that I can control how quickly this bead of water runs down the page. If there's less gravity, it will run much more slowly, naturally. And if there's more, it will run much quicker. These mop brushes are great. This is a mid-sized one, but it holds a nice point if you do need to cut in and around a shape, but also holds a great deal of water in the bristles so that you can cover a large area pretty fluidly without having to go back and re-wet the brush. Yes, it's a shameless plug, but they are great. Speaking of cutting in and around, the top of this is going to be darker. These are going to be darker than the sky, except for these faces I'll save as light, so there's no real need to cut around all of these shapes, but I'm so used to doing it, it's not that hard. The cathedral in the background I am just going to wash over because it will certainly be darker. Here's some violet. The colors I'm using in the sky was essentially cobalt blue. There's a little bit of manganese dropped in, I think. Daniel Smith colors. This violet is a Holbein mineral violet. So here I'm just adding a little drama to the lower portion of the sky by dropping in some violet to suggest clouds, but also just to add a little bit additional depth and texture and anchor, if you will, to the sky wash. Okay. One of the biggest goals for me in painting is always to connect all areas of my painting. So where you stop a sky wash like this, while it may not be tragic, is not ideal for me. So I'm trying to work fairly quickly so that I can begin to connect it to what happens down below. I think it's one of the most beautiful and characteristic qualities of watercolor, and that by that I mean its ability for one thing to morph very organically into another thing because of its fluid nature. So the sky can become the landscape, the sky can become the water, the landscape can become buildings, etc., etc. As watercolor artists, we have the ability to orchestrate our edges, to keep crisp edges or very soft edges. Paintings I like best generally have a compelling combination of both of those things happening at once. So everything's okay. I don't mind that I saved this. I can work with that. I'm not thrilled with the hard edge there. I think that much contrast and that much edge-based painting at this stage is too much. And this is way in the distance, quite separate from my focal point. So I'm going to use some of this burnt sienna light for the tile roofs and bump it up into the sky so that I can kill that edge, make it look a little more fluid and a little less graphic. I keep that idea going by some of this Naples yellow Naples yellow pigment to replicate the stucco color of these distant buildings. Again, I'm not trying to be accurate so much as to what's really there as I am trying to just work with what I think the painting needs. And I know I'm not going to want this much hard edge, contrast, bright, super bright or super dark colors way here in the distance. So I'm just trying to fuzz that out a little bit. That's okay. If you want less clarity, a little mist bottle always comes in handy. And so I'm going to do that here. You might be stressing about these edges. I'm not yet. They're still quite wet. The mist bottle is good. It encourages one wash to run into the next, one edge to become the next. You have to be careful that you don't wash off all the pigment. So I've washed this down to a nice sort of neutral. I can just walk away and leave that. Now I'll add additional landscaping, etc. when the time comes. But yes, I'm going to come back and work with these wet edges to terminate them too. This burnt sienna light will just start to imply some material color for the buildings we see and act as a transitional from the sky tones. Here, I'll bring the violet down just a little bit more and a little darker. But over here, what I'm going to do is begin to drop in some of the landscape that we'll see in the distance. Again, this is distant, so details aren't important. Texture is a little important. Value is very important. This is part of my center of interest from my value sketch, so I know I want some deep saturated values through these columns and sandwiching at both sides. I read all of your comments on YouTube, and thank you all for watching, and thank you for your input. Generally, everybody's nice. There are some complaints. Some people want to always see my palette next to the painting to see how I'm mixing the colors. Others find it distracting and want to get a closer view just of the painting. So I cannot please everybody always, much as I try. So I think my decision is going to be I will do some paintings where the camera's widened out so that you can see the mixing palette, and I'll do some paintings that are slightly more zoomed in like this so you can really focus on the painting itself. This is a cobalt teal. A nice, less aggressive bluish green that works beautifully in landscape applications. I think for this painting, there's really, in my opinion at least, not that much interesting going on in my palette. The decisions and anything interesting is happening here, I should think. So I think for this particular case, focusing a little bit more on the painting may be ultimately more instructive for more people. In the palette, I do nothing except dip my paintbrush in. All the color mixes happen on the surface of the paper. You can see much more about my process by looking at that than you can by looking at the palette. So I'm just sort of making this up. The biggest thing on my mind here is the value. I want deep, rich values here. I'm looking for a little bit of texture and variety so I don't become too illustraty about the landscaping, but I keep it fluid and fresh. colors I'm using, this is a deep jadeite green, and I'm using it pretty, not opaquely of course, but less water so that it turns out to be more dark, more value-based. And right at the very bottom, where I want as much contrast as I can, I'm using just a little bit of a small pointed round Escoda brush, a Versatile series, and I'm dropping in just some neutral tint at the very base of these elements where I know these columns are going to be their brightest. So here I'm building up some of that value. Generally I put my darkest darks in last, but in this particular case they're right there in front of me, so these darkest darks melt up into some of my midtones. So it seems logical I would just put them in now if I can. And I want them wet and wet because I don't want too many hard edges down here, except the edges I'm saving, the negative shape painting I'm doing on the columns. Of course I want an edge there, but for all the background material, all this stuff, very few edges. It's far away and it's not that focal. Don't really have a clue here, so I'm going to, I got to get busy before that dries, because I want to bring this value down to let it darken. A few little dry brush skip marks I think are fine. This is some jadeite green, some of the violet, some teal. I don't want to get too fancy down in here, but a little bit of variety and luminosity is a good thing. Here again is some more of that mineral violet, but it also has some neutral tint dropped in, so it's just a deeper, transparent, but violet gray. Beautiful with that teal. I think it's the violet and teal is such a beautiful combination and very much a go-to for me. This is straight out of the tube neutral tint, as dark as I can get it. It's not black. It's really a deep violet, the neutral tint. And it is still pretty transparent. I just find it mixes so beautifully with other colors. This is why I tend to use it, and it's not as opaque or chalky as a lamp black or an actual black might be. So I want to keep this nice and suggestive, very wet and wet. I like these columnar cypress, but I don't want them too dark. So I am going to drop them in a little bit more obviously with some teal. The sky behind is not dry by any means, but it should be almost set enough that it can hold just a softer edge. Stuck my hand into this wet wash, so I want to re-darken that. Good. Had I not done my little value study beforehand, however, I wouldn't know how dark I needed to go in these areas. So these studies, I harp with my students about them constantly, but they're indispensable for me. I wouldn't know how to paint without them. Everything so far is all right. Really, this is just trying to terminate the first wash in a logical way. The only place that doesn't make sense is right here. Not such a big deal, but I think I can do a little better than that. Just dry brush in some texture, jadeite green. The reference photo is taken in early summer. The green of the grass, obviously I could change it or modify it, but I quite like it. I think the freshness and the newness of it against the ruddy browns and reds of the bits of ancient antiquity is a really nice little sub-story. So I'm going to try to approach that fresh green down here a little bit. The thing to do now would be to roughly finish off everything that's in the distance. That way I can kind of set how much contrast, value, details happening back here, and then really bring this up to get that illusion of 3 dimensions and perspective happening within the painting. Again, the sky isn't 100% dry, but the shine is off of the wet wash enough that I could probably paint in the cupola here of this distant church. I want to keep it light and not very dominant. This is another one of those Neef brushes, but a smaller one. Not the tiniest, but pretty small. But these are, again, really useful for holding a good deal of water, but also you can tilt them up, utilize the point. So this is some watered down mineral violet. A little bit more water than I was using over here, obviously, because I don't want too much contrast back here. I only want this cupola and dome to be hinted at, not rendered, or definitely not overworked. So just lightly, fluidly painting in the silhouette. I don't mind that it has a crisper edge against the sky. I could almost make an argument for misting it so that it looks even softer. But I think because the day is quite sunny and the air is crisp and clean, a few more edges is not necessarily going to be a bad thing. If it were a misty, overcast day, it would be perhaps another story. Yeah, I think that's okay. Although honestly, it looks a little too lucid. So I'm going to drop in a little bit of this burnt sienna light, bring that down into the roof structure again, and just try to connect up some of these shapes. And I may actually mist that bottom of that dome ever so slightly, so it melts here and there into the sky a little bit. And I'll leave that. The thing to do now is, while that's wet, to keep that wet business moving as quickly as you can without stressing out, and lay in these other distant buildings. All the contrast for the painting, for the most part, happens here and here. Not all of it, but the dominant amount of contrast. So anything I can do back here to think about reducing that or using it sparingly is what I want to do. So any kind of architectural details back here, while perhaps not wrong, you gotta ask, what are they bringing to the composition? Are they helping? Are they detracting? For the most part, they're detracting. They're causing too much attention to be drawn to themselves. So I'm just going to knock back a lot of this detail. I'll save a little whites on these facades because they're picking up some more direct sun, but I don't need all of the light. I can just edit away a good deal of it. I think these buildings, in fact, are brick for the most part, brick red. So I'm using a bit of that. And again, I don't feel obligated to make them just what they are in reality, but I don't see any harm in this case of being somewhat true to what they are. And also, I think with the freshness of the green that's going to happen here, the green of the landscape, the cool of this manganese cobalt sky, this warm brick tonality that actually appears on these buildings will be something I can use to my benefit. So I'm using this mid-size small mop brush to just sort of imply detail without showing it too much. This textural Baohong paper is very, very useful in that endeavor too. The texture of the paper can really make it look like you've painted or drawn a great deal more detail than in fact you really have. And that's always my goal, to look like I've done a lot more work than I really have. So yeah, I'm just playing around with the amount of white that I want to be seen. I do think a little is going to be necessary so that all the whites aren't here. They don't look too isolated, but I get sort of a nice vertical rhythm leading back into the distance. That little hint there, some here, and some I expect I'll try to save there. Should make all of that fit more, and I'll save a bit in the landscape down below as well. Here, I love the way that landscape resolved, so I don't want to lose it all, so I think I'll just use some of this gray violet to create the silhouette of those buildings. And then rather than painting all those faces, I'll just use a flat brush. This is an 1/8 inch flat, and just feather that down in and let it resolve on its own. Yep, good enough. Watercolor can be such a high wire act in a way, but it is so fun to play around in the water, to play with these areas of the painting that are not entirely dry and not entirely wet. So you get a lot of interesting and almost always unexpected edges happening. You get this, what I think is a beautiful variety of edges. I'm planner, as you can tell with my composition and value sketches. And I think it is good for me to have a plan of where I want the painting to go. But I just want to be honest and say a part of that plan is building in the knowledge that I don't have full control. It's never going to turn out exactly the way any plan is. It's just not. It's the nature of watercolor to be a little bit unpredictable. So part of my plan has to be for me to metabolize that quirky, mercurial nature of watercolor. A little bit of sun will glint off the this facade of this building, but obviously I don't want as much as is there right now. Maybe that's not obvious. I hope it's obvious. I think this much white is really competing with these slender columns. So yes, a little bit of that white's a good thing. There are a bunch of trees I want to include. This is also a little balcony, which again I could ignore, but I can use it to my benefit, so I'm going to include it because I can paint a nice shadow coming down off of it, just as a way to animate that, but also to eat up a little of that white. You can probably see what I'm trying to do as I get nearer and nearer and nearer. I'm darkening subtly the values, less here, more here, the most here. So I have that in mind as I'm moving across the page. What I want to do here is use a little bit of this red, the sienna, as a sort of stand-in for my reddish brick tone. And I'm going to try to dry brush up from the bottom. Little bits of material color, but also texture to use up some of that white, but not all of it. And that kind of look. So it looks like sun is just glinting off this old, largely brick building. Yeah, that's fine. So there's a little bit of white, so I'm getting this rhythm that I talked about reading through here, but not too much so that it competes. Painting up, especially doing dry brush work, is such a helpful little hack you can use. You can add texture, and it's almost like running a wash, but much more informal and quicker to achieve. And I'll try to resolve that wash down here at the very bottom with some ambiguity. Reds and greens morphing together, wet and wet. This is all a bit more dry, so if I want to add some dry brush texture in there, that's not a bad thing. All right. So at this stage, a good deal of the midtones are in, and you're starting to see my value plan come to life. High contrast, mid contrast, low contrast. Starting to get that illusion of the three-dimensionality reading back through space. This linear, angular, diagonal band of trees, I want to continue here. It is there in reality, you can see from the reference, but I think as part of my story of trying to organize colors and shapes for the painting, I played up more greenery here than is actually visible. So I think visually it'll connect to this band of green reading right through the whole composition in the lower third, lower quadrant of the painting. It all makes sense. So the fact that that foliage is there is what I'm saying isn't as important as can you use it, can you redesign it, can you work with it to make a better painting for yourself. And yes, of course you can. So way over here, what I've painted is not dry behind, and that's good. It's not entirely dry, so I can start laying in these trees and get some of those unexpected edges that are both soft and hard within close proximity one to the other. And what that'll help do is spatially make this band of trees fall in the place where I think they'll do the most good. They'll look far away. These look closer, I hope. So I'm using slightly more water, a little less saturated, a little less dark than these. I have a number of these liner brushes with the fat barrel and the quills that stick out of the top that are just very handy for me for painting foliage. Without very much water in them, you can just sort of scrape them across the surface, especially handy with this textured rough surface paper to get this nice aerated feeling of trees. I've gotten into so much trouble trying to be way too specific painting trees, and it's almost always better to just take a deep breath and just go for it. And definitely don't draw your trees too much if you can help it. Just indicate where you want them, how high you might want them to be. And the liner brush for me was a godsend. If you're interested, if I can remember, I will link to it, that it is made by Davinci. At least they make, lots of people make them. The ones I use are by Davinci, a 5599 series in the Casenio line, and you can get them on Amazon or anywhere. But they're called a liner brush. So yes, here I just made this aerated, not terribly dark band of greenery. I'm dropping some violet into the bottom of it to give it a little weight and dimension. Always when I paint trees, well, nearly always, I'll do the areas of leaves, foliage, pine cone, pine needles first, and before it dries, then I'll scrape in the sense of trunks and whatever branches are necessary. Graphically, I like this. It all makes sense. It ties into this. Color-wise, this is a little fresh looking. I don't know that it's bad. It just looks a little too specific. So I think I'm going to risk just misting at least this end of it so it fades away just ever so slightly. Yeah, this mist bottle is a great thing, but it can be your best friend or your worst enemy. If you overdo it, you will most definitely run the risk of causing a big runny mess on your page, or it'll wash the color right off, and you don't want that. So a little goes a long way. I think what's wanting is some of these columnar cypress, which are all over that area, but don't really appear here. I don't even see any in the reference photo. I just invented them because I thought they would help me tell the story of vertical energy in the painting, and they're relatively easy to paint, if I'm honest, so that's why I did it. But I think one reason this isn't looking quite as attached to this band is because of how many of these trees I used on the left side and how many I didn't use over here on the right. So I'm just going to add some, and hopefully all this will look a little bit more connected. I think it does. Okay. I wouldn't say I'm 100% done with this area, but all the big moves are in. I can come back later if I really think it needs any hint of windows or details. I do think it needs a little, but I don't want to overdo it. So I think what I'm going to do is continue the painting down, started on this fresher green for the bottom of the painting. Then when I get all the major elements in, probably do this next, then I'll have a better sense of how much I think this area in the distance needs, or more likely how much it doesn't need. So for the more foreground grass, I'm going to use dominantly this Daniel Smith Serpentine green. It's fairly olive colored. It's a little much fresher than that dark jadeite, but it's not terribly yellow, a little bit. It's more olive. I'm using a mid-sized small mop brush so I can cover some larger areas, but also with the point I can cut around and save out some of these little bits of white if it's called for. And I wanted to start it now so that I could blend it into this area and connect the background to the midground and then ultimately to the foreground. Here, I don't mind a harder edge, crisper edge there because we're right up against the center of focus where you want more hard edges appearing in general. You can lay this brush on the side and do some sort of dry brush marks too, which leaves these skip marks aerated so they can imply either little bits of marble lying in the grass or perhaps little sparkles of sunlight against the grass. Fine. I'm going to want to modify this green here and there. I know with some olive tones, maybe some yellows, brighter and less bright bits. Green in general, I think, is one of the most challenging pigments, colors to paint with. I love the color green, but I'm not always a big fan of green pigment. Here I've worked in a little bit of raw umber and sepia, just to modify with some warm, some of this cool green tones, and also to get a little darker as we start to move closer into the foreground. What I was going to say is I think one of the keys to working in green is to modify it, variety. Use a lot of variety in your greens, meaning you could make them go from very fresh, more yellowish to more warm. You can modify them with browns and siennas and umbers. A complement of a warm into the cool green is almost always the way to go. But if you want to start implying some deeper, shadowy, shady greens, you can modify them with some blues and violets. But keep them fresh, keep them always changing. So here and there I'm going to drop in some of this deep green too, this jadeite. It doesn't always have to be that dark if you add a little more water in it, into it. This green field could pretty easily have been done in a much fresher green, like a sap green. I don't have any handy, though I'm sure I have some around here somewhere. But I think I'm doing fine with my mixture so far. I'm going to add a few marks wet and wet here to imply some shadows and also to keep this story of this angular hillside going. That's not bad. I want to keep this area less busy than this for sure. So we're moving down into the foreground area of grass. So I'm using more water, more pigment, a little less water. So the colors will be a little bit more saturated, a little less washed out. This is mixed right on the surface of the paper, but this is jadeite mixed with the serpentine. So it is that olive green still, but it has some darker bits in it. I'm going to swap out to a slightly larger mop brush because I need to cover some bigger areas quicker. And dropping in some pure jadeite into this darker wash. And doing my best to keep this diagonal angular story alive. This effect that we're climbing up the hill a little bit. Slightly larger brush has obviously a wider side to it, so I can lay it down flat and get some of these nice skip dry brush marks going, which I like. So that was sort of a first underwash of serpentine, and into that wet I'm dropping in little bits of jadeite for some variety and additional depth. Now as I get right up to the leading edge of the painting, it's a judgment call, but for me, I don't always like harder edges, deeper or brighter values leading right off the edge. I generally like a more neutral or softer finish here. So what I'm going to do is soften this green wash with a little bit of the reddish sienna. Then I'm going to mist this and just let it run off the page. The idea is to keep the harder edges up in here and less so down here. These will cast some shadows, which I can do later in a more graphic way, but I can get a lot of the heavy lifting done now by using the wet and wet. These are white marble for the most part, at the sun coming from right to left. There'll be some shadow sides. So I'm just going to use some cobalt on a few of these and let it run down into the green below so that these look a little more connected to the landscape. That's cobalt. I'm dropping in a little bit of sienna here and there too. I'm unsure here if I want to keep this crisp edge between the grass and this. I thought I did originally, but now I think I probably don't. This marble comes down to here, I believe, and this is a reddish, deep brick base. I think I want it to blend into the sky, into the grass a bit. So if that's true, I should put in some tonality for that now before the grass has a chance to dry. So if this edge here is a little bit found and a little bit lost, I think that's okay. I think that would be good. The green behind is a little drier than I thought, but it's okay. just scraping in some connections. Yeah, it's okay. I'm not in love with what's happening there, but I think I can live with it. But I think while it's still wet, I can beef up some of this green. The warm tones running down into the green. I don't mind it, but it was looking a little murky, so this will help crisp it back up. So I'm going to add a little bit more identity to some of the shadows against the grass once it's dry. It's a bit too wet to do that now. Now I can turn my attention to the top of the painting. Like I say, I'm going to work on the big star of the show up here, and when that is set, I'll be able to tell more how much I think I need to do here and definitely back there. A little bit, but not much, I don't think. For this, I'm going to turn the painting upside down just because it's easier to reach without having to wash over, drag my hand over all that wet area down below. What this will also help allow me to do is preserve the white here, 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 and here by washing downhill this way. So with a flat brush, 1/2 inch flat, and just clear water, this will set a nice neutral edge that I can paint into, just the way I did the sky when we first started. This is raw umber, a fairly neutral warm tone. And then Van Dyke Brown, a deeper warm tone. So before it dries, my job now is to feather that value down into the columns in a more graceful way. So this is my flat brush with a little bit of yellow ochre in. Just some dry brush marks down to pull some of that pigment down into the still slightly wet column. Yeah, pretty good. It's much more gradual, and I don't know if I can call it elegant, but that's the goal. And what the dry brush allows me to do is get these scrape marks and that aerated feeling without having to paint or draw any detail. It implies that I've done a lot, which I haven't. So I'm going to use one of these small mop brushes and start articulating the tops here. I'm going to modify some of the warms. This is some French Ultra Blue. This side will be slightly darker probably ultimately, but the whole thing I want to read is relatively dark. So just dropping in some of these deep cools into the warm bath I've already made. Again, color is important here for sure, but it's really a story of value. And in my paintings, that's 90% of what's happening. Of course, like everybody, I love color, but no color, however beautiful, is going to save a painting with bad or vaguely designed values. So this is just kind of a soup I've built up here of warm and cool tones. I don't really need to get too fancy. I want to keep a little subtle sparkle of light on this side, because even though this whole thing wants to be darker, up near the top I do want a little bit of, I don't want it to be overly relentless or gothic looking. So I used a little bit more yellow ochre, and this is raw sienna, and dropping in some violets at the very top. So sort of a yellow purple complement story happening. And I like that. I think it's better. The blue was okay, but it looked a little gray, so I swapped it out for violet instead. I'll go a little darker still as it gets right up, silhouetted up against the sky. So it's a violet, mineral violet pigment, and at the very top edge I'm using a little of the Van Dyke brown to make the final silhouette up here. I'm trying to keep it kind of scruffy and loose. It is thousands of years old. But the overall shape of it matters, and the overall value of that shape matters more than anything. The colors I use within that shape matter, but not as much as the overall value. This is some neutral tint just at the very far edge. That's going to be the darkest part of everything. Again, it's very helpful now to do this darkest dark. One of the most important parts of the painting, darks the way I want it, because it'll now be a great deal easier to see what else the painting needs, how dark anything else has to get, or whether it needs anything at all. I like the sort of subtle luminosity I maintained up there with the raw sienna. All right, over here, I think I'm going to go pretty light, just a little bit more of this watered down Van Dyke brown. I'm going to add really just some texture. I don't want to be too illustrative or too specific about anything I'm painting. Hopefully this will imply shades and shadows and some sense of the windows, but not so much that it looks like an architectural rendering. You can imply so much with so little. So for this kind of work, I'm using these Escoda brushes, Perla series, number 4, number 6, number 8, little flats. They were nice enough to send me these, and they're brilliant. You can use them almost like flat riggers, if that makes sense. But because they're flat, you can do these beautiful dry brush marks. I think that's probably enough. I don't want to do anything that's too much back here. Yeah, they're there, but definitely not focal. They're not demanding too much of your attention. Most any of you who know me or know my work know that to make a living, for many years I worked as an architectural illustrator. And so I've been painting in watercolor forever. But of course the downside of that kind of work was often, not always, but often that it was my job to show every bit of detail about a proposed building or project. So editing and leaving a lot of things out was not on the menu. So for me to teach myself to loosen up, to edit was harder than anything. But I'm getting there. Still learning. So how are we? This is not dry, but it's getting there. That's okay. Now I'm going to work on this area, and by the time I get that all fleshed out, this should be dry enough for me to add the final bits. There's a combination of white marble and deep stone and dark red bricks, terracotta, and stone down here. All kinds of things are actually going on, but I'm going to try to just paint what I think makes this painting better. I'm hidden the reference photo from myself because this stage, I think I've gotten all out of it I'm going to get, and it'll just confuse and distract me at this point, so not needed. So there would, from some of these artifacts, obviously be some shadowing on the ground. It's not all that critical, but I want all these little bits to look anchored and part of the overall composition. So again, I don't tend to paint things because they're really there or because I'm trying to be so-called accurate, only if they make the painting better. If they don't, I'm perfectly happy to just leave them out. Oh, for this, this is jadeite, but in my palette for once I mixed a little bit of the Van Dyke brown, so it's a deep olive color I'm using. Brush is an 1/8 inch flat. I have some beautiful 1/8 inch Perla by Escoda. They're just heavenly little flat brushes. You might think I should do this at the very end, and there's a good argument for it, but I'm pretty near. Because I have to finish off the base of this column. I think I want to do these darks now. I'm teaching myself because I want to save as much of this white as I can. So this, adding these dark shadows from these artifacts on the lawn, I think will help me to determine how much darkness I need or don't need there. That's a good theory, I'll stick to that. But it does make sense. Yeah, it's fine. I don't want to go too crazy here. This will start to demand too much attention. It's getting close already. So I think now I will finish off the base of the Temple of Apollo, and then we'll assess what else the painting needs. Hopefully not very much. So this is the 1/8 inch flat. I'm going to add a little bit of identity to the very base of these columns. Doesn't need a lot, just enough to imply that they're round, turning the corner. Largely this is white, but it's ancient and been through a lot. It's been through some things, so I want to eliminate some of that pure white with some dry brush marks, just to make it look like a little bit more weathered stone, but recognizing that that white in the whole composition is pretty critical, so I cannot afford and don't want to get rid of too much of it. So hopefully just those few little dry brush marks will be sufficient to make it look like weathered marble. Right. Turn the corner. I'm going to use some of this same tone, the raw sienna that I used up top, to paint the shade side of this column. And the raw sienna, it will be just my attempt to maintain as much of the luminosity as I can. It is a bright, sunny day, so the sun could be bouncing around a pretty good deal, and even in the darker sides of objects, I'll pick up a little bit of reflected or bounced light. The point is, shadows don't always, and I think shouldn't always, be gray and dark and gloomy. Philosophically, if you like that word, watercolor, you know, it's subtractive. People ask me often, how do you paint the light? And of course the answer in watercolor is we don't paint light. The light is already there. It's on the white, untouched surface of paper. So what we do is, as watercolor painters, we paint the shades and the shadows that give light its beauty, its identity. So if you philosophically think about painting in watercolor in that way, then it kind of makes you realize I have to take special care of the way I paint shades and shadows, because they carry the whole identity of the painting. So when I think about it in that way, it makes me think about as much luminosity and character that I can possibly maintain within the shades and shadow areas of my painting. Trying to keep this whole area just sort of impressionistic and gestural. I want it graphically and value-wise to anchor, but information-wise, I don't want it to dominate this or even this. Those I want to stay as the kind of the cleaner, more formal areas, and the rest of the painting much less so. Generally, the big moves are all done. I can now start thinking about what else is needed just to finish up and flesh this out. I think this side is fine, but a little too crisp, and I want to use a little bit of violet dry brush up painting to connect some areas, add a little more texture. Yes, that's fine. And I'm going to go back up top and do just a little bit of this kind of work on the column capitals. The big moves are there, and that is the values and the shapes. So this kind of thing, even if you find it enjoyable, this kind of detailed painting, I think needs to be used pretty sparingly. I want the drawing to do a lot of the heavy lifting up here, so I'm just going to, similar to the way I treated that, with this very small flat, I'll add a few character marks and then just trust in the eye of the viewer to fill in all the rest of the blanks, because they can do that. If you don't show everything in your painting and rely on select detail and implication rather than direct statement, you sort of build up a relationship with your viewers, where you give them a little puzzle almost. They have to, if they like your painting, spend a few minutes trying to untangle. It's a nice little relationship. If you spell out every little thing in your painting, well, I guess in a way you may as well just take a photograph, because you haven't left anything for the imagination of the viewer. And that's not very nice. So yes, I want to add a little hint of detail, the major shadows that'll help tell the story, but not enough that will start to veer into technical drawing land. Oh, I can do that, but I don't want to do that. This is some of the mineral violet. I'll cast an idea of the shadow across. But again, I'm trying to be fairly gestural about it, not terribly specific. Yeah, that'll do. It's all right, but a little too crisp, I think, so I'm going to fuzz it up. This is Van Dyke Brown, just dropping in a few little indiscriminate textural marks here and there. And I like this luminosity, so I don't want to kill it. I'll just drop in a little more raw sienna. So at this stage, I'm just assessing final moves. The value jump here is critical. The value jump here is critical. Both are working. This to me looks good. It fades away nicely. I have a pretty successful sense of foreground, midground, background. Anything I'm not thrilled with, I think this area wants to be a little bit more ambiguous and a little more anchored. Various ways to get there, but I'm going to use some painting up from the bottom and just add some textural identity. Try to knock back some of the harder edges. This is Van Dyke Brown. And just wash over everything. I'm not washing, I'm just dry brushing. This will add texture and patina. It adds value, but it isn't like running a wash, so it's not a solid sheet of color. It's just this textural movement. I think that's better. It helps anchor the painting here and takes away any distracting details. I'd like to do the same here, but I don't want it as dark. So I'll add just a little water to this. I do this often at the bottom of a painting to, like I say, anchor it, to take back any distracting details. You can feather things out. You can also use it to connect areas that you don't find are as connected as they ought to be. And it's the equivalent of running a wash without, again, making a big shape of color or tone. Yeah, and it throws these artifacts into just a slight shady effect, I think, so they don't detract from this, but they still have the luminosity that we work so hard to preserve. And then overall, it acts like a wash to add just a little bit of value to the bottom of the painting, just to help anchor everything. Knocks back the clarity here, which I think is good because it makes the viewer's eye jump over into this area more where you want it. Oh yes, the risk of painting up from the bottom is you can splatter paint over the top of the painting where you don't want it, so watch out for that. But anyway, everybody, there you go. Thanks so much for watching. It's my somewhat reimagined Temple of Apollo, Sociano at the Roman Forum in beautiful Rome, Italy. Again, thanks again for your time, and hope everybody's well and happy painting.